Casting with Ceri Jones.
Hi guys, and welcome to this week's podcast. This week's guest is not a known name to many anglers outside of South Wales. However, at the age of 88, he has some interesting stories to tell. He took me on my first day's boat fishing as a young boy to Chew Valley many years ago. Not going to say how long, mind. But since that day, I have never looked back. Back then, the typical favourite method and cast was muddler, soldier palmer, silver and victor, an appetizer on the point, casting a long line and rip it back. A deadly method, and exciting to watch the bull waves chasing your flies. A method rarely used today. However, on that day, he opened my eyes to nymph and buzzer fishing, something totally new to the scene back then. While I was throwing out the long line to the horizon, he would cast no more than 30 foot, and was like a heron fixed on his floating line tip. Many outings followed, and I was hooked on my newfound fish catching method of nymphs and buzzers. I meet up with him at his home in Talbot Green, South Wales. He still fishes a few times each season at Chew Valley, and has a weekend in Rutland every year. He talks about seasons and anglers past, and his love for the sea trout of South America and salmon of Alaska, which he has caught to over 40 pounds. Welcome to my chat with Dennis Williams. Well, it's good to see you again, Dennis. We go back a long way, don't we?
Yes, we do. It's nice to see you, Ceri.
I think the first time we met was in the Osprey fly fishers, and
That's
you
right.
were president then. One thing which I can say, the thing that stands out to my mind when I think of you, was the very first time I fished on a boat.
Yes.
Was actually at Chew Valley, and it must have been in my teens it was then, you know.
Yeah.
And I was in awe, you know. Never start with just fishing on a boat is one thing. Like I was used to fishing muddlers and pulling wets, and I noticed that when I was casting, I was, you know, like probably 15, 16, long lines, 20, 30 yards or whatever, whacking and pulling it back. You only had maybe, I would say, 20, 30 feet of
right.
line out and fishing nymphs.
Yes.
I never experienced or seen anything like that then. I think if I remember right, you were catching them on a phantom pooper, was it?
Not on Chew. No, I used a phantom pupa later, but they were on Chew. I'd use a pheasant tail on the point, orange fluorescent buzzer, and a green fluorescent buzzer, and then the fourth fly on the top would be an amber longhorn.
Wow, was a fly, I remember now, yeah.
Fly of the past, yeah.
Yeah.
Really, I used to use that at Rutland as well regularly, but on that particular day, which I remember well, that was my cast on that, my team on that day.
And you could say on those days, way back then, really, that was the start of nymph and buzzer fishing, wasn't it? Because wet flies and lures really was the
When I started the buzzer fishing, there was nobody else around about. And what started me nymph fishing was one of the old Osprey members, Danny Lewis.
I remember, from Hopkinstown.
That's right. And Danny showed me some nymphs, first of all, and that sort of got me thinking about nymph fishing. But then I saw in the trout fisherman, or trout magazine, trout and salmon rather, a advert by a fisherman up in the North Country who'd selling buzzers. Now, I thought, well, I'll buy a pack of those and have a look at them and see what they're like. So I bought this pack of buzzers, and in it was these fluorescent orange and fluorescent green. I took them apart, actually. Never fished with them. I took them apart to see what they were, because all these were around about size 10.
Yeah.
So I took them apart, and then I tied some of my own. And I tied them from 16, 14 and 12. And that's the way I used to use them. Well, they're heavier on the bottom, of course. The 12 on the bottom and 14, 16. And that was a very successful team. I mean, I used to use that at Rutland or wherever I went, really. And then this was before anybody locally, anybody I knew locally anyway, were using buzzers.
Yeah.
And there was certainly nobody else in the Ospreys using buzzers at the time.
No.
But so that's where my buzzer fishing developed, really.
And I think it probably, would you have anything to do with your coarse fishing background? Because you did coarse fish as well, didn't you?
Yes, I coarse fished for some years and trout fished at the same time. But due to coarse fishing, of course, you develop that method of, and you develop a lot of patience, of course, which you need when you're buzzer fishing, because I mean very often you fish with a static line, and I mean some of you probably heard of Arthur Cove.
Yeah, the Cove pheasant.
Arthur Cove, he was the sort of heron on Normanton Bank in Rutland Water, and I had several chats with him.
Did you?
And he would stand there motionless. You know, you'd think he was a statue really at times, and he'd just move the fly a little inch at a time, and then he'd pause for, a minute or so, and then another little tweak, and that's the way Arthur Cove fished. And of course, he was very successful.
Yeah.
So I probably learned something from him as well, because that method certainly worked then. Doesn't work so well now. I have tried it in recent years. I still catch fishing static nymphs, and static buzzers rather, but not as successful as it used to be years ago.
That was a fly I used to fish a lot of, actually, the Cove's pheasant tail.
Yes.
Because it was, if I remember right, it's a pheasant tail body, wasn't it? But it's a curve, not just the standard pheasant tail, the Sawyers. It was the curve coming around the shank, and then it had, was it hare's dubbing, wasn't it? Hare's mask doubling, I think.
That's right.
Yeah, with a copper rib.
Yeah.
It's funny how you forget flies.
Yes, yeah.
Like on those days, the most popular flies at that time, what I remember, are things like Ace Spears, Baby Doll, Sweeney Todd.
Yeah.
They were more attractor patterns than imitative patterns.
That's right. Particularly at places like Rutland Water at the time, after Rutland Water opened, Baby Doll and things like that, they were the most popular flies. I can't remember the names of some of the others, but I stuck to my own team though, always,
Yeah. I was keen after that experience of tying a load of buzzers then. And I remember then I tied some fluorescent green buzzers, which I hadn't come across before, which you told me. And we went to Horseshoe Lake.
Yes, that's right.
Remember?
Yeah.
Down by, I think it's by Malmesbury way. I'm not sure if it's a carp lake now.
Yeah, Cirencester, that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Rainbow Lake next door to it.
That's right.
Yeah, there's lots of fisheries around then. But again, it was so good, and it was like your casting line out. I remember you standing next to me, and he said, just watch your line. And I was just watching. I wasn't looking where the flies were. And then you see a little dick, and then I'd miss half of them. But then you had to be really quick, didn't you?
That's right.
Again, nowadays.
Yeah, well, that was the method, really, was cast it out and watch your line rather than wait for a pull. You watch the end of your line if your eyes are good enough.
Yeah.
And as soon as you saw the move there, tighten into it,
Yeah.
Never strike as such, but just tighten the line.
It's so exciting, because half the time, if you felt it, you'd missed it.
Yeah, oh, that's right.
Yeah, very visual. Like.
Yeah.
But I remember as well, because we went fishing lots at that time, over the space of a year or so. And one thing I do remember, apart from the fishing, what I noticed you've got one here now outside, you had a Mercedes car, and it's the first time I've been in a car to 100 miles an hour. And it was a stretch between Story Arms and Libanus. I don't know if you remember. I really remember it because I could see that needle going up.
Yeah.
And I think we were going to that day, either Clywedog maybe, or some pictures you showed me earlier on, Ross Fisheries. It was on that day, it was, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Clywedog, of course, was very popular with us at that time. You know, I mean, Ospreys used to take a couple of trips there a year, you know, have a club competition there, and then a competition against the Llanidloes Club, and other competitions. Then the Clywedog Shield was held there, and we had the Morrie Suite there on a couple of occasions as well.
And they used to have the European Open. They haven't got that
Oh,
there, no?
yes. Well, that I fished in the first one there.
Did you?
And I went down to my... on Clywedog, I had one point where I always fished. And it was a little... Actually, it was an island at times. Just a little... I remember seeing you fishing there.
The Clwyd.
And that's right. And...
yeah.
I mean, that was my favourite spot there. That's where I almost always went, as Clywedog. But when I fished in the first European Open, I thought, I'll go down to my usual spot. But I went down, I couldn't get on it. I'm not sure, I think you were on it.
The water was high, wasn't
It
it?
was high.
And I went in at my waist, actually.
But that competition, I won't name names, but there were a few cheats present.
Was there?
Yeah.
Ah.
And I know that one chap that didn't catch any fish, well, he must have caught a couple, but he weighed in a lot more than he'd caught.
Ah.
Whereas a couple of his friends didn't. You know.
Yeah, I know what you mean, sharing the bags.
Three of them. So I won't go any further in case he may be listening. And
But the Clwyd, after then, the times we used to go, that's my number one spot now. Because it goes up into a riverbed then, doesn't it?
That's
and
right.
It's deep.
yeah.
And there was three of us when we used to go. There was myself and there was Bob Hyatt as well.
Yeah, well, on two occasions now, I won the Clywedog Shield there 3 times. I'd won it one year, and on that second year, I took Bob Hyatt came up with me, and Bob beat me by about half an ounce. So we brought it back. You know, we'd already taken it up in my car, so we brought the shield back. Bob had it for a year. So we went up the next year then, and I brought the following year.
Oh, did you? We went back in the same car?
Yeah. So I won it 3 times, actually. And but Bob won it that once in between, and we'd gone up together, you know.
Have you been there in recent years?
I haven't been to Clywedog now for quite a few years. Oh, I do remember the year. It was 1985, I think I last fished Clywedog.
Was it?
Yeah. And because it was after then I got involved in the theatre, which took more of my time than I could spare, you know, to go trout fishing. But I did trout fish still. I went regularly with Bob to Chew and Blagden, of course.
That's what I saw you last year, wasn't it? This year,
At
last season.
Chew Valley, that's right.
Having breakfast.
Interviewing John Horsey.
Yeah.
So we fished Chew and Blagden for years, and but we always go to Rutland as well for 3 days. For many years now we've done that. Apart from 2 years, we went to Rutland Water. Gone off a little on 1 year, so we went to Bull Bridge and had a very good 3 days on Bull. And then the following year we went to Draycott, which again was very good. But we ended up going back to Rutland, where we're going again this year sometime, because of the restaurants there. The evening procedures drag us back to Rutland. There are some very good Italian restaurants in Rutland, in Oakham.
Oakham, yeah.
And so that's where we...
I haven't been for a number of years, religiously like you. I would always go, and we always used to stay in the same place. It was a B&B called Mrs. Waite's.
Mrs. Waite. Well, I introduced the Ospreys to Mrs. Waite because I used to organise the boat trips
Yeah.
to Rutland for Osprey. And, of course, Mrs. Waite's was one of the places. The other one was the hotel down in the town. I forget what it was called then. It's now called the Whipper Inn. Not a good name for it. And there was another pub which the boys stayed in on the way to Mrs. Waite's. But, of course, Mrs. Waite could take about 10 people at the time. She had a shed in the garden.
Did she? I can remember that.
Yeah. And some in the house. And I remember that the first trip I organised up there were 40 of us went up. And we had 20 boats. And these were in the days when Rutland had inboard diesels.
All right.
And they were great boats because if it was cold, you sat on the motor and warmed up. But they were great boats and they were absolutely steady in the water, even in the highest of winds,
Yeah.
But, of course, they changed them eventually because any servicing with an inboard diesel, the boat had to be lifted out of the water, you see. So, of course, that was costing money. So eventually they went to...
So you plan to go this year now, then?
Yes, we're going this year. We haven't decided on the date yet. Possibly in July this year.
And you go with Bob?
Bob Hyatt.
Bob Hyatt, yeah. And Bob Challenger?
Bob Challenger and Gwilym Appleby. That's our team for this year, as it was last year.
You hit the restaurants?
And the rest, well, we'll have a choice of restaurants there. There's one very good pub there. And a couple of good Italian restaurants, So there's a good choice of eating places in Oakham.
Do you fish locally these days anywhere? Just Chew, I guess, now and again.
No, I mean Chew is the nearest local, really.
Yeah.
Chew and Blagdon,
Yeah.
I haven't been to Llandegfydd for some years now. And, of course, the rivers, although Ospreys have got a very good stretch, of course, on the Taff, which I was responsible for negotiating them to have from a friend of mine who farmed up there. And we went up before the mines closed and viewed the river. And I can always remember after the mines closing that the water, it ran clear. Within about 3 weeks, the water was running clear. Up until then, it had been absolutely black,
Yeah.
And anyway, I was responsible for the Ospreys getting that stretch of water. And I think at the time, I'm not sure what they're paying for it now, but I think at the time, we arranged a price of £60 a year.
Wow.
For the whole stretch, which was...
They've actually got, as well, Cantref Reservoir.
Yes.
And I fished that in the last year, and I was surprised how good it is, actually. It's just wild browns, it is.
Yes.
But we're having a few over the pound, which is nice.
I did fish it some years ago when they took it over first of all.
Yeah. No, sorry, it's not Cantref. I got that wrong.
No,
it's Beacons.
Beacons, the top
Beacons,
one.
yeah.
That's right.
Beacons Reservoir.
Yeah.
I was surprised at how good it was, to be honest. Was you part of the gang, you could say, which formed the Ospreys? How did you come about the club?
Well, a few fellas got together, Lynn Price, Brian Ward, and a few others. They got together, and Aldo Merengue was one of them as well. And they decided to form a club, mainly for fishing reservoirs. And we all chipped in a tenner. Aldo persuaded me to chip in a tenner, although at the time I only fished the rivers, fished the Esk and the Wye. And I chipped in £10 as well, but I never actually fished with them until 1977. And in the meantime, they'd fished for a number of years. I can't remember what year they started. I think it was the very early 70s. And they went fishing around, and I'd read about them in the paper, in the local press, about some of their exploits. And it was 1977 when I used to go to Aldo's Cafe in Trehavod. And I went in there one day, and he persuaded me to try reservoir fishing with him,
Yeah.
And but the first time I went was to Blagden Reservoir, and I fished in a boat with Clive Summerfield, and we had a bad day. We blanked almost up until gone 5:30, and I hooked a fish, and it turned out to be a brownie of £6.
Wow.
And in getting back then to the jetty, I got out, and I'd only just bought a rod specifically for reservoir fishing, because up until then I'd always used on the river a 7-foot Alcock's Tarquin split cane rod.
7-foot split cane.
Yeah, Alcock's Tarquin, and which I bought in Jack Lexton's. Nobody will remember Jack Lexton, I don't suppose. Jack Lexton had a shop in Penarth Road in Cardiff.
All right.
It's long gone now, I mean, I think the gas board built a building on it eventually, but it was that was one of the well-known tackle shops of the day, and I bought this Alcock's Tarquin there to fish up on the Hondy and on the Usk. But anyway, 1977, I went up for lunch in Aldo's Cafe, and he persuaded me to come up to the Osprey Club, who that time were meeting in the some rooms above Lloyd's Bank in Pontypridd.
Yeah.
And Lynn Price was the secretary, and they persuaded me then to come on this trip to Blagden. So as I said, we fished there on the boat, came up to gone 5:30, and I hooked this fish, and it was a £6 brownie. And I had this brand new rod which I bought, a 10-footer, from the chap who at the time was the president of Ospreys, Sandy Palmer. And he was lived in Caerphilly. He was a bit disabled, but he made fiberglass rods. And a lot of the Ospreys had them, 10-foot fiberglass, which was a good rod for reservoir fishing. So I'd bought this rod, and in the rush then to get back to the weigh-in, I got off the boat. Cardinal sin pointed the rod forward instead of backwards, pointed the rod forward, and in running to get to the weigh-in, run into a tree with my rod and snapped it on the very first time.
Oh, no.
But as it happened, Sandy Palmer got to know about this and gave me another rod.
Did he?
Yeah. So I had 2 for the price of 1, or 1.5.
How did you do in the competition?
So the competition then, I went to the competition, and of course, £6 brownie, I won it.
Oh.
Because that was my very first competition, and I won it purely.
I bet it was on a
because of
nymph
the
or a
one
buzzer
fish.
as well, was it?
Oh yes, it would have been. Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. I can't remember which one actually, but I know it would have been on one of my team of buzzers.
You were saying you fished Talabont or the river going into Talabont in the early days as well.
Yes, well, I used to fish it from the top of the hill, coming down into Talibon, and at that time, you couldn't get across the stream without waders on. It was a.
Yeah, it's a brook now, isn't it?
Yeah, and it was in later years, of course, that they planted all these pine trees on
Forestry.
both sides of the mountain there, and of course that takes all the water. So it's only a stream now, whereas it was, by the time it got down to Talibont, I mean, it was a decent sized river.
Yeah.
Because there were a lot of other little streams joined it on the way, but of course the water's all taken up now by the trees.
Do you fish Talabont? No.
I haven't fished Talibont. The last time I fished there was with a club competition, and probably that would have been about 1983, 85, something like that.
I remember we fished it once or twice in those days, and throughout the years then, each season I'd have one day there, a day ticket. But last year, I had my full season there for the first time. And I love it. It's gripped me, you know. It's not an easy place to fish, but it's only browns, wild browns, not stocked.
Yeah.
And it's predominantly the last hour of the day, you know, you're going to get the most activity, unless it's a dirty, dark day, you know, where they're active, you know. But like I said, that brook, that top end is a good spot where the brook comes in. I can imagine what it was like then with the river.
That's right, where it comes in. Well, when I joined the Ospreys then, and whenever we fished Sallybont, that was the only place I fished, was where the river runs in, where it comes in. Because there was a nice pool there as well, and pool formed there. And that's where I used to fish there, and I nymph fished there, you know, or buzzer fished rather. I always did well there.
You're in Talbot Green now, but you weren't originally from Talbot Green. You were from Rhondda as well, weren't you?
I was from Tonopandi originally, and I lived above what was then the 50-shilling tailors. You could buy a suit for £2.10.
Was it?
And then, of course, it went into John Collier's took over. I think it's a travel agent now. But that's where I started my fishing from when I was about, well, it was just at the end of the war. That would be 1945. And I used to get a bus down, as it happens, to Anasmarty, which is just up the road from here. The bus used to stop near the bridge. I'd go in there with a homemade net and a jar. And fish from minnows and small, get the occasional small trout as well. And we'd fish from there right up to the bridge where the road runs over to Llantrisant. And this was long before the mint was built there, of course, long before it was thought of.
So how old were you then?
12.
That's when you started, was it?
That's when I started. But in later years, of course, I moved to Talbot Green, and then I started fishing the river up there again. But I'd fish it from just at the bottom of the hill here, really, the start of the golf course, and I'd fish it all the way down then to where the mint is now, and then I'd fish back up. I'd fish down one side, cross over the bridge, and then come back up to the road bridge near Talbot Green. And I've got a couple of stories about that. I mean, one story was I was fishing down. I used to go in the night, you know, and fish for just a couple of hours.
You wouldn't fly fish then?
Yes, fly fishing.
Right.
Yeah. And this was after I moved here to Talbot Green. And I went down one night now. I mean, you didn't have to cast very far, you know. It was just a little little roll cast often, you know. And I caught a fish, just over half a pound, which was, a pan-sized fish in those days, which I didn't always keep fish from there. I put them back very often. But on this occasion, I thought, I'll keep one and take it home. So I caught this fish, put it on the ground beside me instead of in my bag, walked on down another 20, 30 yards or more, fishing, and I thought, I'll go back now and pick my fish up and carry on down. So I went back up, and the fish had gone. So I thought, crikey, that's strange. So I looked around, and then I looked up, and there was an owl in the tree, and the owl had my fish in its claws.
No.
On the branch, yeah. He'd picked up the fish and took it up to the branch.
You wouldn't think an owl would you?
Anyway, I thought, well, he deserves to keep it after that, so I let him keep it and went on fishing. But another funny story, on an occasion again now, I went down, fished downriver, crossed over the bridge, fishing back up the other side, and there was a fence there, a wire fence, and I used to crawl under the fence to get to come back up, you know. So I got to the fence now and put my rod under, crawled under, and as I was crawling under, I thought, well, I haven't seen these trees before. There were 4 trees. I thought, I haven't seen these trees here before. And so I got out, thinking I'd come to the wrong part of the river, of the fence rather. And I stood up, and then, of course, I realised I'd crawled under a horse. and the horse was, a horse...
With the biggest shock, you were the horse.
They sleep standing up sometimes, obviously, because this one, he wasn't asleep when I stood up. So I was so taken aback by this, I started talking to the horse, And that was one thing I'll always remember about that. Now, of course, then in later years, they built the mint. And, of course, when they built the mint, they ruined the river because they concreted most of it down in steps in case it flooded, Yeah. And so I've never fished it since. I did go up once and try to fish it, but, of course, with concrete steps, and the fish weren't keen on living around that area, So,
yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah.
You've done a fair bit of travelling as well, haven't you?
Oh, yes.
With your fishing. I noticed you showed me some pictures there now of South America.
Well, yes.
Who actually got you to get into fishing for South America? Wasn't it? Was it Arthur Oglesby?
No, Arthur, actually, I met Arthur Oglesby around about 1995, I think it was, or 94, at the game fair. And Arthur at that time used to do the casting demonstrations, because of course he was a tremendous caster. And I got chatting to him there, and he said, "Oh, why don't you come up?" And at that time I hadn't done any salmon fishing, I'd only trout fishing up to that time. And he said, "Why don't you come up and come on one of my casting courses on the Spey at Castle Grant?" So I did. I went in 1995. I went up, and I went on one of his courses. And I mean, some of the others that were there, of course, had never cast a rod of any sort in their lives. But I had a bit of experience because I was a trout fisherman. But Arthur taught me how to spey cast and double spey cast, And so that started me salmon fishing then. And then, of course, at the time he was running trips to Alaska. So I booked and went on one of the trips and fished with Arthur in Alaska.
Wow. And
I went there for several years then, following ever since. And it was one of the chaps I met while fishing up on the Spey, a fellow called Jim Cunningham, who was still a great friend of mine, a great character, Scott. And whenever we fished, actually, I used to go along as his interpreter. So if he's listening to this, he'll know. Anyway, he'd had one trip to Tierra del Fuego. So he said, "Why don't you come to Tierra del Fuego?" So, of course, we went. We stayed in a grotty hotel, really, in Tierra del Fuego. A little side story to the first time that we went there. I was staying there. It wasn't all that long after the Falklands War. And we went in, we were in the hotel one night in the bar, and who should come in but a troop of Argentinian soldiers. There was a camp nearby. And the sergeant spoke quite good English. So he came up to me and he said, "You English?" So I said, No, I'm from Wales, I'm Welsh. "Ah, Wales," he said, rugby. So I said, "Yes, that's right." So he went to my friend Jim Cunningham, who was a Scot, and he said to Jim, "You English?" "No," he said, "no, I'm from Scotland." So, "Oh," he said, "Scotland, yeah, whiskey." So then he went to the third man, another friend of mine, still a friend, a fellow called David Wilkinson, a retired sea captain. So he went from Newcastle. So he went up to Dave and he said, "Are you English?" "No," he said, "well, I come from, I'm English, but I come from very near Scotland." So I said to this sergeant, I said, why do you ask? So he said, "England, Mrs. Thatcher, best woman in the world." So I said, "Oh, why do you say that?" "Got rid of Galtieri, because Galtieri, was hated by most people in Argentina.
Is it?
I mean, in Buenos Aires, there was a big wall probably still there, and they did demonstrations there for many years after Galtieri had died. But there was this wall in Buenos Aires with all the photographs of the thousands of people that had disappeared during Galtieri's reign in Buenos Aires, you know.
Well, she did something right to a certain extent then.
But the fishing, that was tremendous. We'd fly out to Buenos Aires, stay overnight, and have a steak in the best restaurant in Buenos Aires, down on the front. And although it was the best restaurant, I mean, the meal, steak, and as much as you could eat, and all sorts. I mean, it would cost about £2 or £3, you know.
Wow. Is that a must-have? Wherever you go fishing, you've got to have good restaurants, is it?
Oh, yeah, that's right. So anyway, we'd carry on. The following morning, then we'd take a flight down to Tierra del Fuego. And the gillies would come and meet us from the lodge. At the time, we stayed with a fella, and I can't remember his name, but he'd been in the Argentinian Air Force and survived. And he was running these trips where Jim and Dave had been the year before. And we went there. Anyway, we stayed in this grotty hotel in Buenos Aires and had to travel to the river. But this one day, now we were out fishing on the river, and this chap comes along, and he looked like a local, you know, old anorak on, and came up and started chatting to Jim, my friend, who was quite a character. Always had a joke to tell, you know, and was chatting to Jim, my friend, and then the gilly, the guide rather, said, "Come and have a cup of coffee now." So we went and had a cup of coffee, and this chap had a cup of coffee with us, and he said, "Oh, I'll tell you what," he said, "why don't you come to my house for dinner this evening?" So now on the way out, we'd passed several little shacks, you know, because made out of some of them obviously with bits of cardboard and whatever they could find, you know.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, crikey, I hope it's not going to be dinner in one of those. Anyway, he goes off now, and our guide says, "Oh, you were the lucky ones," he said. "That's Fernando Menendez. That's the name of the man. That's Fernando Menendez. He owns the estancia," he said. "And his estancia," he said, "is quite something when you go there." So anyway, the guy brought us down that night, and we went in for dinner, and he had this tremendous bar, and with every sort of drink on it you can imagine. And anyway, he came in and he said, "What wine would you like with your dinner?" So he said, "Well, I don't know, what have you got?" "Come down to the cellar," he said. So this was all built by him, and he dug down deep enough in the cellar to build this storeroom for his wine. We went down there, and he had 9,000 bottles of wine.
Wow.
One of the reasons being, he's the director of Mendoza Wines.
Never. And he invited you to his place?
Yeah. Now, the estancia was some place. I mean, this estancia was where he had lived and still lived himself. He lived in Buenos Aires, but he had this house as well, which belonged to his grandfather, etc. But in the estancia, there was churches, bars.
What's an estancia then? What is it?
Estancia, well, it's
An estate?
a ranch.
Oh, the ranch. All right, yeah.
And 3 dining rooms, one for the gauchos, which was considered to be, the gaucho was considered to be the top of the top employee, you know.
All right, yeah.
And he had a team of gauchos, of course, because they'd travel up to 100 miles, I think, really. And but eventually then he said, "Well, come and join us, and you can come and stay here in future. You know, you're paying for the fishing, so you can come and stay here." So from then on, we stayed in this. We had a suite each, you know. The bathroom was the size of this conservatory that we sat in now. And
So he owned the fishing rights?
Oh, he owned
owned the river.
He owned the river. He owned the whole area, which is probably about half the size of Wales.
Wow.
Because he took me one day for a trip on it to show me around, and we went almost to the foothills of the Andes, you know.
Wow, that's an experience.
And
what's the fishing like there then?
oh, absolutely incredible. It's mainly sea trout.
Right.
You do get the occasional rainbow as well, which has gone to sea, you know, and come back. And but mainly the fishing is sea trout. But of course, I was fishing there, and one year I hooked this fish, and I said to the guide, I said, we had to have a guide for every 2 fishermen, you know. And
so is it a big river?
Oh yeah, it's quite a big river, the Rio Grande, and I mean, you fish in. The wind is tremendous. Of course, that's why Tierra del Fuego. You could never fish into it. You've always got to have it.
Would you be fishing a double-hander in those rivers?
We fished a double-hander. Now, a lot of the Americans that were coming there were still using single-handers then, but we only used 15-foot rods. And the Americans were in awe of it at that time, you know, of seeing a 15-foot rod. They said, how do you handle that rod? You know. And,
yeah.
But anyway, fishing on this estancia, Maria Behetti, the estancia is called, and the sea trout fishing is tremendous, of course. You know, I mean, you catch 20-pound fish, common. You know.
Really, sea trout now.
And but anyway, on one occasion there, I hooked into this fish, and I said to the guy, "This doesn't feel like a sea trout." I said, "It's a different fight to it entirely, and it's a big fish." So anyway, eventually I got it in, and of course when the guide saw the fish, he said, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "Well, it looks like an Atlantic salmon to me." And of course, on examination, then we took a couple of scales out of it, took photographs, put it back, and then downriver was an American team doing some research on the river. And so I gave the
samples,
the scales to this American team, and a day or so later they said, yes, it's scales from an Atlantic salmon. And of course it was verified as well I sent it to Trout and Salmon, and I've got a couple of letters as well from it. So it's so far, and as far as I know, it's still the only Atlantic salmon ever to be caught.
And how big was it?
It was 17.5 pound.
Wow!
It wasn't big by the by the sea trout standards, but it fought a lot better than a sea trout. Which is why I said to him, it didn't feel like a sea trout, and when I was playing it. Anyway, as I said, and it's as far as I know, it still stands as
salmon
as the world record of a Atlantic salmon caught in a Pacific river, and of course, well into a Pacific river. Right down at Tierra del Fuego is the.
So you've had 20-pound sea trout from there yourself?
Oh, cricky! I think the best one I had was 29 pound.
Wow!
But
how do you fish for them then?
With you can throw the line in the air, and the wind would take it.
Is that strong?
Right across to the other side.
And what sort of flies and leader strength would you use?
Big flies, big. You use almost half a pack of marabou, you know.
Oh, was there? Marabou?
Yeah. But other flies as well. Prince nymph, only big 3-inch. But some of the flies you use were tremendous, up to 6 inches long.
Yeah. And what breaking strain would you use then, the leader?
Oh, minimum of 20 pound. That's the most I always used to use, never more than 20, but you had to use that because it's,
And you'd cast across sort of 45 degrees and just swing it round then, is it?
Well, normally there we can't straight across because with the wind. I mean, the wind is tremendous. When you're walking up the bank, for example, sometimes you're walking at an angle of about 45 degrees.
Really, as bad as
because
that?
the wind is so bad. Yeah. But you can always find a place to fish on the Rio Grande because it snakes all the way. So you can always find a place where it's over, over your left shoulder or immediately behind you.
Are you allowed to keep them then? Or it's a return, is it?
No, all the fish in Tierra del Fuego you return.
Yeah.
In Alaska, we were allowed to keep a couple. Of course, in both places, you fish with barbless hooks.
So in Alaska, you fish a salmon then?
Salmon in Alaska, all the different types of salmon. And I did catch a nice big brownie up there as well, and a rainbow.
What was the
And grayling, good for grayling as well.
Is it?
Mainly the salmon, the most popular one is the chum salmon. Now, I'll tell you a little story. One of the party that always joined us was Josie. He was a Portuguese. And we called him Josie because, first of all, we called him Jose.
Yeah.
Because we thought, the spelling was as the Spaniards pronounced Jose. But he said, no. In Portugal, it's Josie, not Jose. So anyway, Josie fished with him several times. Could hardly speak English, but he knew all the swear words. He picked up all the swear words from Jim, my friend.
All right.
My Scottish friend, Jim Cunningham. Anyway, Josie only went, he was a coarse fisherman in Portugal, but he always came to Alaska to catch the chum salmon. And to catch 200 in a week was that was just below average, really, I suppose. You caught that many chum salmon.
And what size would they be then?
Oh, again, well over 20 pounds.
Really?
Yeah. And there are other there, of course. You've got the sockeye, the pink, and the king salmon as well. And anyway, going back to the chum salmon with Josie, on one day, he wanted to see how many he could catch in a day. So he had to help him, Jim Cunningham, my Scottish friend, and Dave Wilkinson, the sea captain. And Josie was casting out. He'd hook a fish, just partly play it in. He'd hand the rod to Dave, who would bring the fish in. In the meantime, Jim would hand him another rod, hand Josie another rod. He'd cast out again till he hooked the fish. And then when he hooked that one, he'd bring it back in for Dave. And so Dave was playing the fish for him. And Jim was loading the rod and handling the rod. And in the day, he caught 200 chum salmon.
Wow.
In a day's fishing.
But he slept that night.
But so that was the only way he could do it, mind. There were three of them, really. He had two helpers. He was hooking them, and the one was taking them off, and the other giving them a rod.
Feel free to visit my online shop on my website, where you will find a selection of my most popular Irish sign prints, plus a choice of gilly kettles and cooking accessories. Or if you would like to experience one of my guiding and instruction packages, feel free to message me. Or again, take a look at my tuition and guiding page at castingwithkerryjones.com. There you said you had a 40 pound one day, and then shortly after, Grace Oglesby.
Well, the first, I had a couple of 40 pounders. The first 40 pounder I caught, I was fishing for chum, and with a floating line, single fly, and anyway, the guide that we had, a very good guide, and he said, I think it's a king salmon is further down the pool there. So I said, shall I try for him? He said, you've got to get right down for the king salmon. So anyway, I cast out, long cast, and I let it sink and sink and sink and sink. I was standing in the water at that time, and the boat, because we always had a boat fish on that river, and I let it go down, and I felt a pull and hooked into it, and lo and behold, I'd hooked a king salmon. Started playing it, and he said, "Get in the boat," he said. "You're not going to land it standing in the water." So I got in the boat, and we went downstream, because it just turned, and it wanted to get back to sea, you know. And it turned, and we had to follow it down about 1 kilometre before, and try to reel in and let it go, and then reeling and letting it go. Got it in eventually, and it was a 40-pounder. Wow. But another 40-pounder I caught, it was this was after Arthur Oglesby had died, you know. And his wife Grace carried on with his trips that he had going out to Alaska. So I was there one day fishing with Grace in a boat, and with a gillie or a guide rather, called Scott Howell, which Arthur Oglesby always said was the best guide in the world. And we were fishing there, and I hooked a 40-pounder, brought it in, and about a quarter of an hour later, Grace, she was a very good fisherman, Arthur's wife, Grace Oglesby. Grace hooked a fish, brought it in, 60 pound, beat me by 20.
Jeez, that was some fish, isn't it?
Yeah. We were allowed to we weren't allowed to keep kings, but we were allowed to keep sockeye and the chum if you wanted, but the chum apparently were not good eating, you know.
Yeah.
But the sockeye were. But the sockeye, now that's a strange thing to see, because there were lookout towers on the river where a man would fly in and he'd be staying there for the day or more to count the sockeye coming up the river. Now the sockeye, when the sockeye comes up the river, they come in a pod like a flock of geese. You get the one in the front, and then all coming behind. And of course, the sockeye, it's a filter feeder. It doesn't actually feed. You know, it comes up the river with its mouth open, taking what it can, and it goes back out through the gills, obviously.
Right.
And so you've got to target your fish, really. If you spook them, they've gone. But you can actually see them coming up river, because they swim up on the surface with their dorsal fin out of the water. And this is the way these counters count the fish. They see the start of the pod coming up. They see how many lines of pod there are in the pod. And so they know how many fish are in that pod. So they know in a day how many fish are going up river. The reason being, they want to keep the number of fish in the river, rather than let the John West boats, which were in Bristol Bay at the bottom of the river, and if the salmon count went down, they could stop the boat fishing.
Right.
And but of course there'd be a few boats down in the bay, and I don't know how many.
Have you been there in recent years?
2006 or 7, that might have been my last time.
So how long have you been retired then?
I retired in 1998.
Oh, that long? Jesus.
So that's 24 years now.
Because you had the car business, the tyre business rather.
I started off with the tyre business, started that in 1959, 60. And then, of course, in 1983, I still owned the tyre service, but I started a company called Scenic and Property Hire, making scenery for the theatre.
How did you get into that? Because that's not something, it's an obvious thing to do, is it?
Well, I performed as an amateur before I went in the army. And then when I went in the army, it's a great long story, but eventually, because there were 2 Welshmen in the regiment, and the regiment, they wanted a singer for their band. It was a very good military band, and a really top-class dance band. Where most of the players went out and made a name for themselves in music business in this country. And they wanted a singer, so they put up on orders, we'll Trooper Williams and Trooper Coghlan, which are the only two Welshmen in the regiment, report to the band office. So we went to the band office, and the bandmaster had brought in a professor from a Detmold Music Academy, which is one of the top music academies in Germany. And so he said, well, I'd never sung in my life, because actually I'd gone to a Catholic primary school, went into Tonopandi secondary school, and of course any from the Catholic school weren't allowed into assembly. We were all shepherded off into a classroom until assembly finished. So I never even sang in assembly, you see. So I'd never sung in my life.
Why would that have been?
I don't know. They just wanted to keep the
Catholics different.
Catholics separate, I suppose.
Right.
And anyway, that's how I started. Anyway, the professor picked me, and they said at the time I qualified as a tank driver, signaller, gunner, and anyway, the professor, they took me. I went to live in academy for Detmold Academy for quite a few weeks, and I learnt 7 songs, and I came out in the end of May 1951, and we immediately went on a tour of the UK with the band as the singer.
Right.
So at the time then as well, I took up the clarinet, and eventually I got into the band as well as a clarinet player and sax player in the dance band, but and the singer, of course. So I did that then for 5 years. I was a regular. And then in 1956 I came out and I went straight into a nightclub in London as a singer and played the baritone sax as well. And in those cases, of course, the nightclubs in those days, I mean, it was a bow tie job, you know.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
not the clubs that
Yeah.
that we know of these days. And I did that, but I came home and I'd been booked to do a summer season in Redcar in Yorkshire with a band called Danny Mitchell and his band. And anyway, I met a girl and decided I'd leave it a little while and go back at Christmas, because I was also booked to go into a pantomime in Bradford, the famous Bradford Alhambra. Time took over and I never went back full time. I did some part-time work afterwards. You know, I sung in Princess Hotel in Bermuda, and I sung in Diplomat Hotel in Hollywood, Miami, and the Colony H Hotel on Palm Beach, and a few other places. Went to sung in Jamaica as well. But generally, then I was hooked into an amateur company. There was a company in Tonopandi called the Mid-Rhondda Operatic Society, and a young friend of mine, Derek Cleverden, was in the group there, and he persuaded me to come up one night. He said, "Well, the company are looking for somebody to sing Old Man River in Showboat." So anyway, I went up and sang for them, and I got the part. And that was my start then in amateur operatics. So over the years, I probably did hundreds over the years, you know, sung in all sorts of places. I did quite a lot in the New Theatre. And
So did you find there was an opening then for stage backdrops and stuff?
Yes, there was really. And, you know, I having been a solo singer, there was, you know, I had a bit of an advantage over some of the others, because, of course, I never suffered from nerves, because I'd sung in front of, you know, audiences of thousands of people. You know, I mean, probably at the time, the biggest one I ever sang in front of was in the open-air theatre in Scarborough, which held 9,000 people. Of course, these were in the days when foreign holidays really were only a thing for the very rich people, you know.
Yeah.
And these were in the 50s, and so I didn't do a lot of fishing in those years. But one of the band members, a fellow called Derek Valance, and he had a rod. And I can remember we stayed at one time in the Intelligence Corps camp in Maresfield in Sussex, and there was a lake in the camp. And Gabby knew that I'd fished a bit, so he said, "Oh, come along, we'll go and fish in the lake." So we fished, coarse fish it was. We fished in the lake there, and that was a bit of my fishing while I was in the army, because it was very difficult to carry a rod around, with a rifle.
Yeah.
So, but not that I had a rifle after I joined the band. Well, we were pistols, anyway. The cavalry used pistols, of course, not rifles.
Right.
You can't use a rifle in a tank. But there we are. Anyway, so I didn't do a lot of fishing during those years until I came out of the army then, and immediately went fishing straight away, more or less. In 1957, I started fishing again then, in earnest, going over to Chew a couple of times, but we fished mainly the rivers,
Yeah.
Wye and the Usk. And I had a friend, and I must mention my friend, Bill James. We were friends from when we were boys of 10-year-old. He lived in Tonopandi. And when I came out of the army, then we got together again, and we fished regularly. Now, Bill, he had a box. His father was a cabinet maker. His father made this box for him to carry his gear in. You've never seen anything like it. It was absolutely immaculate box.
Yeah.
We had Mitchell 300 reels, and all the floats, and they were all set out regimentally in the box. And but Bill never went fishing. He always dressed to go fishing, and he always wore a tie to go fishing. He was a character, but he was a very shy man, really. Never got married, and he did have one girlfriend, and I had to go along with him, But anyway, we did a lot of fishing together on the Usk and the Wye. And I can always remember fishing on the Wye, and Bill hooked this perch, a big perch, and he brought it in, and when he was getting the hook out, you could see there were 3 other treble hooks in this fish's mouth. And it was a fairly big perch, And so, he spent most of the afternoon getting these hooks out. He'd work a little on a hook, then he'd hold the fish in the water, for the fish to revive. Then he'd get it out and he'd work it out. Eventually he got all 3 hooks out as well as his own, and put the fish back, and the fish survived. And of course he was a man that never killed a fish, always put them back. Trout, whatever it was, they went back. A great friend of mine, and I miss him tremendously. And he used to keep his rod behind his front door, so that at any time when I called, I'd open the door and I'd say, "Come on, Bill, we're going fishing," and he'd be ready. And he'd come as he was. He'd just put a anorak on, and he'd have his clothes with his tie still on, and
just the image.
We fished, yeah.
Do you tie flies these days?
I did tie some last year before I went to Rutland. I tied a couple extra to go to Rutland. Not that I need any extras, because I literally have thousands, which I need to jettison these days. I can always remember there was a fisherman, one of the members of Oglesby, Bill Fishfingers, and he'd won a couple of the Fisherman of the Year before I did. And I can remember him saying one day he'd got all his flies and he just scraped all the dressings off and tied all new flies.
Did he?
Yeah, but he said, they were, once in a couple of years, and he said, no, they're no good. But mine, I've got some flies there that now probably about 40 years old.
And do you know what? It reminded me. You got shields there in the fishing lodge there from the Ospreys days. And my first competition shield, which I'd won, was for fly tying. And we used to have it, and you touched on it earlier. In the early days in the Ospreys, used to have the meetings upstairs in the Lloyd's Bank. It was always a Wednesday, and it was a great experience. Everyone's up there tying flies. And one thing I remember, it had like a Velux window on the roof, and it'd always be open. And because it was on a Wednesday, we could always hear the noise from Sardis Road, the rugby. Pontypridd would be playing there, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, the early days of Ospreys, you know, some of the people I can remember. I mean, Lynn Price was the secretary, and then there was Brian Ward, who was quite a character. Cliff Harvey, of course, Derek Thorne, Brian Couch, Bob Challenger, and Lou Ride, of course, as you mentioned. Harry Bainham, and of course his son Dennis Bainham, who Dennis is now the secretary of the club. Danny Lewis.
Going on to your theatre work as well, because you've done a fair bit of acting as well, didn't you, and TV work?
Yeah.
You don't do anything like that now, no?
No, I have been asked. I'm still I'm still on the agent's books, on a couple of agents' books, and in fact, just 2 or 3 days ago, I had a call from an agent asking me to do a job in a few days up in Gloucester somewhere. But of course, today was one of the days, so I turned it down.
Oh, was it?
But I haven't really worked just before lockdown.
Yeah.
And I did a couple of casualties then, you know. Of course, most of my acting was on stage, and the last stage show I did was My Fair Lady. I played the part of Higgins, which is a part I did 5 times in all, actually, in various places. Once in Ireland. And I did it with a company in Aberdeen called Stars. And my daughter had auditioned for them. And she was playing the part of Eliza Doolittle. And they couldn't find her, or they didn't have at that time, a suitable Professor Higgins. So the producer contacted me and asked me would I go along, you see. So I went along, and my daughter said, well, you can't do this, you know, there's a love interest, you know. So of course I said, yeah, of course, but it's acting. I've acted as a lover several times. So that was it. And of course, unfortunately, that was the last show that Caroline did as well, because she passed away in 2013, you know.
Yeah, I remember. That was a shock out of the blue,
Great
wasn't
loss.
it? On holiday, wasn't it?
Yes, in Italy.
Terrible.
You know, I still can't believe it, you know. It's still...
Because she did quite a bit of acting, didn't she?
She was a good actor, a good singer. She could have been a professional. She went to Aberystwyth University, but the music department took history. But yes, she did a lot of work with the music department because she was a good singer and a good performer.
And Joan as well, she's been...
Well, Joan, yes. Well, Joan did so many parts as well. And this is how we met originally. Well, not how we met, because Joan was from Kenry Street in Tonopandi, and her brother, Graham, her elder brother, was the same year at school with me. So I was friendly with the brother. I knew of Joan's existence, but, you know, girls were not the in thing then. You know, boys, we wanted to play sport and do various other things.
Yeah.
But anyway, Joan went to university and started teaching in London. And then, unfortunately, in 1960, I think her father passed away in the floods that we had in 1960, you know, and he did a lot of work and it must have affected him somehow. And he passed away. So Joan came home. And she came home then and got a job then in school in Porth. And she joined the Rhondda Theatre Group, a group which I had formed some years earlier. And we were cast together. And well, she came first of all, and she did South Pacific, which was the first stage show that we did as a company. And Joan was in the chorus. And I was playing the lead at the time. And then the following year, we picked Carousel as the show to do. And Joan was cast as Julie, and I was cast as Billy Bigelow.
I don't mean nothing to me. They are a couple.
Well, they're the leads.
All right.
Well-known singer, Gordon McRae had been Billy Bigelow, and so for the he was a good singer as well. And so I did that part, and of course, in doing the part, we got to know each other very well, and one thing led to another, and there we are, and we're still together now after 50. We've been together now for 53 years.
That was a perfect casting then, wasn't it?
Yes, so there we are.
Because I've done quite a bit of, I started off doing the TV extras work like yourself,
I remember you started an agency.
Yeah, and we did all right, and I was doing various things like Doctor Who and Merlin, Casualty, stuff like that. And then I started getting speaking parts then, mainly for Bob Lacombe and Welsh-speaking productions then, And then I got asked for a few more, and then, to be honest, I got into it because it's just for the money. I didn't have the passion really for it, but I kept getting asked to do speaking parts. And the last one I did was about 2 years ago, just before lockdown again. There was an agency called Beautiful Bearded Bastards. I don't know if you've come across them, actually. And they're from Scotland, but they're an agent and they get different work. And they cast me as a headmaster in a BBC production up in Dumbarton in Scotland. So they flew me up, and accommodation and taxis and everything to do it. And I had quite a lengthy script as well, And do you know what? It wasn't for me. I done it, and it all went good. But the preparation and I'm not very good at learning lines, I got to look at something and read it 40, 50 times for it to sink in. Some people can look at it and bang. But so to me, for what it was worth, it was an experience, but I'd rather just be in the background, no?
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate in learning lines. As a very good memory. I mean, which stuck, Although I had an accident about 18 months ago, which has affected my memory, but memory for lines I still have. And, for example, My Fair Lady, I could go on and do it tomorrow night.
Really?
I only need to look at it again. I can remember most of it now, And so I always had a good memory for lines.
Yeah.
I used to try and make it a habit never to carry a book in rehearsal. If I knew what we were doing, I would really not, read that part so that I wouldn't have to carry a book around in rehearsal.
Right.
And I very rarely did, I certainly didn't in My Fair Lady because I'd already done it 4 times before I did it in Aberdare.
Going back to your flies, like you were saying, you got thousands of flies going back maybe 40 years or so. If someone told you, right, what would be your 6 flies to have in your box? Because a lot of the time, we've all got thousands of flies, hundreds of flies. But a lot of the time, you only stick to like half dozen patterns, for most of the time. Are there any patterns which you would have to have in your box then?
Well, I would certainly go with a pheasant tail and my buzzers, and then I'd put in the diaolbach.
Yeah.
And, of course, also for fishing in Welsh waters, the cockamondi, which was Cliff Harvey's favourite fly,
Yeah. They definitely fish catchers, aren't they? Those patterns, they've stood the test of time. People still, especially the diaolbach.
Yeah, and of course there are so many variations of the diaolbach now.
Yeah,
but the original will still catch fish.
So, what would be your goals for this year?
Well, we go to Rutland. I'd like to have a couple more days on Chew and Blagdon, and my goal is just to have a good day, really. And end up with a good meal. I've caught all the big fish that I want, really. I caught hundreds of really big fish in my trips to Argentina and Alaska.
Yeah, well, this brings me on now to one more question, because You spoke about various places all around the world, really, you fished. Where would you want to be to make your last cast?
Well, I think if my wife was with me, I would say Tierra del Fuego, because the accommodation was so good and the food was so good, and the fishing, of course, was out of this world. Tierra del Fuego,
Yeah.
catching sea trout of that size, and of course that's where my so-called world record comes from as well.
Atlantic salmon.
But the salmon, yeah. Yes, the accommodation, everything about it was good.
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed our chat, and it's been a long time coming because we did pencil this in for a while, and I hope maybe this season we'll have a day somewhere. It'd be nice to have one on Blagdon or Chew again.
Yes.
Well, the first time we did fish together.
That's right.
Well, many thanks,
Well,
Dennis.
thank you very much, Ceri. I've enjoyed it, and as I said, on my list of favourite people, friends that I've known in the past, and current friends, well, obviously you're one of them, because because I'd always remember that first day you came with me.
Yeah.
For another reason which I won't mention, but
What was that? No?
well, I will mention it. But you kept on casting out to your right, and we were in a drifting down. You
Yeah.
see, you were casting out to the right. So I said, "Why are you casting there, Ceri, instead of forward?" He said, "Well, I've seen a fish out there," and of course it was a different fish every time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Can't remember that, can you?
No.
No.
No. Yeah.
I can remember you casting out a few times out to your right, because I was
Yeah.
on the motor and you
You
were
was,
at the
yeah.
front end. I can remember that vividly, actually, of you casting out to the right.
Is,
And of course, it was your first day on the.
yeah.
On
We
a-
both caught fish, but I couldn't fit. It really was an eye-opener for me, because you were literally one flick and you were just 20 foot of line out,
Yeah.
you know, and in the evening it was
So,
like,
well, occasionally I just do a roll cast, you know,
yeah,
which, when I'm in fishing on a place like that.
yeah. I thought, you say, we got tangled or something then, I can't remember. Maybe we might
No,
have
I
done.
don't think we ever got tangled. No,
Yeah.
we were far enough apart in the boat, I think, and you were
Yeah.
fishing with your right hand. I can fish with my left, both hands.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, not as good with my left, but I can cast with my left hand. So in a boat, it's very handy. You know,
Yeah.
if you're on the motor and you're fishing left-handed, and your man on the front is fishing right-handed.
Well, when we go out now next, I'll be casting to the side instead as a fish
Yeah.
to the side of the boat.
Well, it works these days. But in those days, the fish were running up, and of course, they'd run towards the boat, and they'd veer off to the
Yeah.
right or left anyway. So, you were right to try and fish there, obviously.
I think by doing it now, you learn these things over the years. But now, if I was fishing, I'd always cast at an angle, because you're drifting forward, you're covering that wider line going
Yeah,
down
that's
than
right.
just straight ahead.
Yeah,
And
it's true.
yeah,
It's true.
yeah, we'll definitely have to plan something. Definitely.
I've got 1,000 more stories, but there's not enough time.
Oh, we'll have to
tell
have a part 2.
them. Yes, it's been a great pleasure.
Well, many thanks,
Well,
Dennis.
thank you very much, Ceri.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon, where you will get 2 extra podcasts each month. That's one every week, plus bonus content, photography, and other exclusive content, plus access to over 60 plus episodes. You can join my Patreon channel by visiting patreon.com/Casting with Kelly Jones, or see the links on my website, castingwithkellyjones.com. Or see my posts on Facebook and Instagram. Well, that's all for now. Tight lines and don't strike too soon.